Good evening and welcome to the panel discussion Black Marxism, Anti-Colonial Activists in the Comintern. My name is Bibi Roleman and it's my pleasure to guide you through this evening tonight. I'd like to continue to introduce our guests to us. To my left we have Professor Hakim Adi, and he is professor for the history of Africa and the African diaspora at the University of Chichester. He did pioneer work on the history of the African diaspora in Britain, and he widely researched and wrote about the history of Pan-Africanism, its entanglements with communism, and also its effect on anti-colonial movements. He also wrote a very important book on this topic. His book, Pan-Africanism and Communism, The Communist International, Africa and the African Diaspora, 1919 to 1939, is one of the leading publications and really a must-read on the topic. And then I'd also like to mention his most recent book, Pan-Africanism, A History. He also presented this book here in Berlin yesterday night at EOTO, and it's very readable. You will later on have the opportunity to get a copy of the book in the back at the book table, and it's really a pleasure to have you here in Berlin, not just for one but for two events. And then I'd like to introduce Dr. Robbie Aitken. And he's a senior lecturer at the Sheffield Hallam University. His main areas of research are the history of the African diaspora in Germany and in Europe, European colonialism, and the construction of race in Europe before 1945. He especially did pioneer work on the history of the first black community in Germany, and he wrote the important book Black Germany, The Making and Unmaking of a Diaspora Community, 1884 to 1960, together with Eve Rosenhaft. He also widely researched and published on this still not enough recognized part of German history as I see it in my regard. Now we will dive deeper into the topic, and first Hakim Adi will tell us more about how black activists were involved with the Comintern and why Germany, especially Hamburg, was an important place for this activism. And afterwards, Robbie Aitken will tell us more specifically about this black anti-colonial activism in Germany and in Berlin. And he will tell us more about the life of a certain activist named Joseph Bilé.
So I'm going to try and explain this very, very long history, which took me 10 years to write about in about 20 minutes. That shouldn't prevent you from reading my book, which goes into much greater detail than I can go into. Okay, so the Russian Revolution of 1917 was, as we know, an earth-shattering event. And so that event could not fail to also have a major influence and impact on African people struggling all over the world, whether in the African continent or in the African diaspora. And even before the Communist International was formed, there were already Africans who were welcoming the revolution, welcoming the spread of Bolshevism, because they argued that if the destruction of the capital-centered system had begun, this would be a very good thing for Africans in general. When the Communist International was formed, we find this this influence extending. I should say just two things. You can see here a picture of Lenin. There are a number of things that should be said about the Communist International. First of all, it was the only international organization which had a anti-colonial platform as one of its statutes. You could not join the Communist International as a communist party if you did not take up the anti-colonial struggle. Secondly, it was an openly anti-racist organization. It was the only international organization that had an anti-racist platform, as you can see illustrated in this Soviet poster. Thirdly, it not only considered the brotherhood of man, these are the days maybe before gender sensitivity and so on, not only regarded the brotherhood of working and oppressed people all over the world as a moral issue, but as an important political question. So Lenin's analysis of imperialism showed that we can say the colonial countries, the dependent countries, were just as important for the world revolution as the so-called advanced capitalist countries like Germany, Britain, and so on. So for the first time, you can say in terms of theory, the struggle of colonial peoples was a key issue for the communists globally. And that was the attitude of the Communist International. So it's a very important, you could say, moment in the development of Marxism and development of revolutionary theory. So all of this had an influence on Africans who were struggling for their liberation, whether in Africa, the Caribbean, the US, Germany, Britain, forever that was taking place. I've illustrated that by just mentioning this organization, which actually is an African-American organization, the African Blood Brotherhood, formed in 1919 by a Caribbean migrant to the US. But you will see it's a Pan-African organization. It's interested in Negroes, black people, Africans, all over the world. But its members quickly became interested in communism, the Communist International, and the revolutionary developments in Russia. And here is one of the leading members of that organization, Claude Mckay, the famous Jamaican poet and writer who was was in the US at that time, had previously been in Britain. And we see him in 1922 at the 4th Congress of the Communist International. Now, I should also have mentioned that from its first days, the Communist International took up the question of African liberation. In those days, people referred to it as the Negro question. The Negro question meant the question of how Africans globally were to liberate themselves, were to empower themselves. So even at the first Congress of the Communist International, this was discussed. And it was introduced by Lenin himself at that time. So by the time of the 4th Congress in 1922, I think, this was a subject which was being discussed. Claude Mckay addressed this Congress. He wasn't an invited delegate to the Congress, but he was so encouraged by the revolutionary developments in the Soviet Union and the creation of the Communist International that he wanted to address the Congress. And at that Congress, he said that the Communist International should do more to recruit black members. There was great potential amongst Africans and so on. So this Congress is important because it set up a special Negro commission. And the gentleman on the left here, Otto Huiswood, who was a Surinamese communist, one of the founders of the communist movement in the United States, chaired that commission. That Negro committee or commission discussed this Negro question as a global question. In other words, the Communist International had a Pan-African conception of this question. That although the struggle of Africans in Germany is different from the struggle of Africans in Cameroon, they are related issues. And these things were discussed at this Congress, and the Communist International began to develop its policy on this question. under the direction of black communists as well as others who were concerned at that time. And the communist parties of those countries which had colonies or had a particular involvement with Africans or people of African heritage were directed to take up this question for solution. The British Party, the French Party, the Portuguese Party, the American Party, the South African Party, and others. This was their responsibility to find solutions and to assist those Africans who were struggling wherever they were struggling. This general policy of the Communist International therefore attracted support in many different countries. Here we have an example from France. This is Münzenberg, a communist member of the Communist Party of France in this period, in the 1920s, who became a leading figure, not only in the Communist Party, but he created an important organization, Comité de défense de la race nègre, in 1927, which was a Pan-African organization under the leadership of the Communist Party of France and the Communist International, we can say, to make it a simple story. He also became an important, and here is the, I've forgotten I put this slide in. So here is the Comité de défense de la race nègre. It's paper, la voix des nègres. As you can see, they use the word nègre as a bit of a strange word in the French language, but they said they were reclaiming this word as workers, as African workers, and if they use that word, they'll make sure they don't have any bourgeois members because those people won't want to be called nègre and so on. So this is a reclamation in the same way that the word black was reclaimed in the 1960s. Okay, so here we have Münzenberg and others at the famous conference in Brussels in 1927, a conference which was called and led to the founding of the League Against Imperialism. And as you know, behind the organization of this conference was the German Communist Party and Willi Münzenberg and others. This conference in 1927 also had its own Negro Commission under the chairmanship of Münzenberg, which had members from many countries, South Africa, the US, the Caribbean and elsewhere, who also discussed this question of African liberation. It's important to point out here that what made the Comintern's analysis and discussion of these questions different from others at the same time was that they had a revolutionary orientation. The orientation that colonial rule must be abolished, and that would be the act of Africans themselves, obviously in consort with the workers and oppressed people of other countries. So they developed a program, unlike the Pan-Africanists such as W.B. Du Bois or Marcus Garvey, who had aspirations but did not develop any program to bring it about. So this is 1927. And here we have Willi Münzenberg with two of these leading black communists from this period. On the left, James Ford, African-American, important African-American communist. On the right, or as it were, your right, Garin Kouyaté, who was at that time member of the French Communist Party and the leader of the successor of the organization set up by Münzenberg. In fact, this is one of the other congresses of the League Against Imperialism, I think actually the Frankfurt Conference in 1929. So this is an ongoing policy which is being organized by the Communist International and involving black communists from throughout the world. Then in 1928, we have the founding of the International Trade Union Committee for Negro Workers, which was established under the auspices of the Profintern, or Red International of Labor Unions, which was the trade union organization of the Communist International. This organization was set up principally because the major communist parties were not fulfilling the requirements of the Communist International. So they were not taking up the Negro question for solution with sufficient vigor, and so they were criticized. They were criticized by their own black members, those that had black members, and they were also criticized at many congresses of the Communist International. That why isn't the British Party doing anything? It has all these colonies, or Britain has all these colonies. Why is the British Party doing it? The French Party, the US Party, the South African Party, and so on. Why doesn't the South African Party have any African members, for example? So these were the criticisms. So this organization was established essentially to work with the communist parties, but also to organize with the trade union movement and to organize amongst black workers internationally, okay? In the US, Britain, France, Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, not South America, which had a slightly different organization, which I won't go into now. So this is an important organization. From its earliest days in 1928, it has its own paper, which is published in English and French, generally monthly, and James Ford, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the early editors of this paper. Then, from its early days, the Communist International had been discussing the idea of a world congress or world conference on the Negro question, if you like, a Pan-African conference, which for various reasons could not be organized until it was held in Germany in 1930, in Hamburg. The reason it was held in Hamburg, well, there are two reasons. The first is that it was supposed to be held in London, but unfortunately in Britain we had a Labour government in power, and therefore they banned the conference, and so it had to be, I don't know why you're laughing, it's not funny, and therefore it had to be held in Hamburg. It was held in Hamburg obviously because the Communist Party of Germany was particularly strong in Hamburg, and so it was much easier to organize. The conference itself was extremely difficult to convene. Some people were prevented from attending from Africa. It was difficult to organize in the Caribbean, and even in Europe, some people didn't arrive in Hamburg. But people did come from the US, from Africa, from the Caribbean, and from European countries. And here we have a photo of some of the delegates in Hamburg in 1930, where they discussed all these important questions, some of which I've already mentioned. I can go into more detail later. From 1930, 1931, it was decided that the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, the secretariat of it, should be based in Hamburg. And that was, initially it was run under the direction of James Ford, but then under the direction of George Padmore. George Padmore, Trinidadian, joined the Communist Party of the US and then became a key activist during this period. And he also became the editor of the Negro Worker with the assistance of others here in Germany and also with his Austrian wife, as she was called at the time, who maybe I'll say more about later. So one of the publications that George Padmore presented during this period in 1931, The Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers, which you can still find editions of it. Again, it's perhaps interesting from our point of view that it has all kinds of statistical information about the kinds of challenges and struggles and difficulties that Africans, people of African heritage in Africa, the Caribbean, Europe are facing, and also presents a way forward. And it's interesting that although Padmore later parted company with the communist movement, he still championed this book to some extent anyway. Yes, I just showed this. This is another publication. It's a kind of alternate to the Negro Worker. You can see here it was also published from Hamburg in that period from 1931. Okay, so I always like to put in a peer of Germany's national hero. You all know him, yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so when George Padmore parted company with the Communist International, the secretariat was organized by Otto Huiswood and his wife, Hermina, who you can see here, who, of course, I should have pointed out that obviously after 1933, it was impossible to organize the organization from Hamburg because as you're aware of that history, I think, yes. And Padmore was arrested and deported to Britain. And so there had to be a reorganization under Huiswood, which was initially based in Belgium, and then in Holland, and then eventually in Paris. Okay, very, very quickly, how much longer have I got? You're not checking? 10 minutes? 15 minutes? Oh, great. Okay, I'll slow down then. Okay, fine. So I wanted to just give some examples to show the kind of global reach of the Communist International on this question. So this is the paper of the South African Party. What I want to show you here, umsebenzi is the Zulu word for worker. It was initially called the South African Worker, but the criticism of the Communist International was that really the Communist Party of South Africa wasn't African enough, I think is the best way of putting it. And so it underwent a change of membership, a change of leadership, and also the title of the paper changed. I could again say more. One of the big campaigns which the Communist International became involved in, and particularly the black communists in many countries, was the famous Scottsboro case that you may well be familiar with. 9 African-American young men were arrested on a trumped-up charge of rape and sentenced to death. So there was a big campaign during this period, much of it led by William Patterson, another very prominent African-American communist. And here is Ada Wright, the mother of 2 of those boys. She went on an international tour, which she came to Germany, Britain, France, Moscow, and various other places. This is actually in Scotland in that period. Then we have also the question of the fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was another big issue for the communist movement internationally, but also for African black communists internationally. This particular demonstration of black communists is from Cardiff in Wales. Okay, so again, although I said that the Comintern took up the Negro question as a related, if you like, a single question with different parts, different aspects to it. So in the US, the Communist Party had its particular position. And of course, the most famous aspect of that is the idea of what later was called Black Power. But in this period, people talked about self-determination for the Black Belt. The Black Belt, the area you see shaded here, where African Americans are the majority population. Again, I can go into that if people are not familiar with that, maybe later. The positions of the Communist International and the Communist movement obviously appealed to a wide variety of people, not just activists, but also cultural workers and so on. And so Langston Hughes being a very good example. This autobiography includes his visit to the Soviet Union in that period and what he saw, what he witnessed, the transformations of the Soviet Union and so on. And of course that was common for many people who traveled to the Soviet Union, but particularly those from Africa and the African diaspora. You know, W.B. Du Bois went there in 1926. When he came back, he said, if this is Bolshevism, if what I've seen with my eyes and heard with my ears is Bolshevism, I'm a Bolshevik. So it actually took him about another 40 years before he joined the Communist Party, but that's another question. Okay, oh, there he is. Amongst those influence, okay, we have people like Aimé Césaire, a later communist, Jacques Roumain, the famous Haitian poet and the founder of the Communist Party of Haiti, Jomo Kenyatta, who studied in Moscow, Paul Robeson, the well-known actor, singer, athlete, and communist. Elma Francois, who was a national heroine of Trinidad and Tobago, another communists from this period are organized amongst the unemployed and the workers of Trinidad in the Caribbean. Claudia Jones, Isaac Wallace Johnson, who was a labor organizer in Sierra Leone in West Africa, who was imprisoned by the British during the Second World War for his activities, and one of the key figures in the Manchester Pan-African Congress and the founding of the World Federation of Trade Unions in 1945. Andre Alakay, who was assassinated, as you can see here, in Martinique in 1933, was one of the leaders of the communist movement in that period. I should point out that, just in case people don't realize this, that being a communist then, if not now, was a very dangerous profession. Nearly all of the people that I've spoken about were arrested at one time or another, or were exiled, or were, in this case, assassinated. So it's important to bear that in mind. And it was often more difficult for those who were actually black communists. I guess Hilarious is a good example of that. Anyway, later we have Kwame Nkrumah and others and so on and so forth. So, I don't know whether is that my time? Okay. So if people haven't, or don't know of this book and are interested in that subject and think that the few minutes I've had wasn't sufficient, then here it is. You're welcome to have a look at it. If you can't wait, I've written a chapter summing up this whole book, which I put in the new book on Pan-Africanism, which is at the back. So you don't even have to go home without it tonight. So.
Good evening, everyone. It really is fantastic to see so many people, so thank you so much for coming along. I tend to speak very quickly when I speak in English, so if I am too fast, please ask me to stop, and I will slow down. I want to just very quickly, though, thank Postkolonial Berlin, ESD, Each One Teach One, Stiftung Rosa Luxemburg, and in particular Andreas for initiating and for organizing this entire event. Thank you very much, Andreas. On the 8th of December 1929, here at Alexanderplatz in Berlin, the Union of Socialist School Pupils staged an anti-nationalist and anti-colonial demonstration. And this was part of increasing anti-colonial events being organized and run by the political left within Germany, under the direction of the Communist International. The second speaker of the afternoon was this man here. This is Joseph Ekwe Bilé. Bilé from Cameroon was enthusiastically greeted by his audience, which included a further 5 Africans. Now, he proceeded to inform his listeners about the brutality of the German regime in the former colony of Cameroon, as well as about the abuse and mistreatment suffered by people of African heritage worldwide. The German authorities' attention was very soon brought to his propaganda activities. And in light with a foreign policy which continued to cling on to hopes of regaining the former empire, Bilé's opinions were unwelcome, and they led to a very serious discussion about his potential deportation. For the president of the German Colonial Society, the former governor of Cameroon, and colonial revisionist Theodor Seitz, Bilé's political agitation was symptomatic of something more dangerous. Seitz argued, "I'm convinced that under the current economic conditions, the natives who still find themselves in Germany will fall completely under the spell of communism." And his suspicions were not entirely unfounded, because several weeks earlier, Bilé and 6 Cameroonian contemporaries had formed the Comintern-sponsored radical anti-colonial group, the League for the Defense of the Negro Race. So what I'd like to do in the brief time that I have is use Bilé's political life in order to highlight aspects of this very much forgotten history of the anti-colonial, anti-racist activism of Africans living in Germany, particularly in Berlin in the late 1920s. So I want to look at why the League was created, have a think about some of its activism, and take one concrete example, which was a really quite remarkable theatre project. This will hopefully in turn highlight the ways in which Bilé and the League intersected with some of the networks that Hakim's been telling us about the anti-colonial network of not just the Comintern, but also wider black internationalist Pan-African networks. Let me start, though, by just saying a little bit about Bilé himself. Who was he? Well, he was born in 1892, he was one of maybe around 250 to 500 black residents in Berlin in the late 1920s. The vast majority of whom would trace their roots back to Germany's former empire. Many came from Cameroon, quite a few came from Togo, and of course they had foreign families in Germany and had children. I want to show this image because most of the people who came arrived pre-1914. And this shows us two of the very few women who came, both of whom were related to Bilé. So we can see, gotta come away from the microphone. The tall lady is Esther Sike Bilé. This is Bilé's sister. The younger lady is his cousin Berthe Ebumbe Ebenge. And you can see them here with Eduard Schever, who was the man who formed the Berlin Baptist Mission, which was then active in Cameroon itself. Both of the ladies came around about 1899. Sike stayed for 2 years. Berthe Mbenge stayed for 13 years in the city and was very successful in school. Bilé himself came much later. He didn't arrive in Germany till 1912, sent by his parents, who were very wealthy and influential, sent to be educated. And he studied civil engineering at the technical school in Hildburghausen in Thüringen. So, whilst his siblings managed to leave Germany before the outbreak of war, Bilé, like several hundred African contemporaries, became effectively stateless and stranded in Europe as a result of the fighting and the subsequent peace process. This saw Germany stripped of its overseas empire, its colonies placed under mandate protection, and in general, the new mandate authorities, primarily the French and the British, were completely unwilling to allow these Africans now to return home. So for people like Bilé, they were now stuck in Europe. Bilé served briefly in the German army during the war, but like many African contemporaries, in the post-war period, he very much struggled to find employment. He moved around from East Prussia to Berlin, to Vienna, and back to Berlin over the course of the 1920s. And it's against this context of increased economic crisis in the late 1920s, of rising racial prejudice, that the League for the Defense of the Negro Race will be created. We could perhaps see its creation as part of a longer history of anti-colonial protest amongst Africans living in Germany, sometimes in connection with the wider labor movement, sometimes out of their own lived experiences of colonialism or their experiences of just trying to create a life worth living in Germany. So some of the other examples you will probably be aware of would be the likes of the petition sent to the National Assembly by Martin de Bobe, the Cameroonian train driver, a petition that Bilé also signed. We could think of the Afrikanischer Hilfsverein, the African Welfare Society created in Hamburg in 1918, of which Bilé was a part. But we could also go further back and think of people such as Mpondo Akwa, or indeed of Alfred Bell, Belly Ndumbe. So we can definitely say that this is not the first time that Bilé has been politically active. We can also say this is not the first time that Africans in Germany have been politically active. So why are we finding this group in 1929? But it's partly linked to both of these men, who we've already seen, thanks to Hakim. So from the beginning, the League was brought under the influence of both the Comintern and wider related developing networks of Pan-Africanism. It was formed in the presence of the French Sudanese radical, that's Timoko Garan Kouyaté, who we can see here, secretary of a similarly named organization, the Ligue pour la Défense de la Race Nègre, based in Paris. With others, Kouyaté was trying to create a network of African activists based in Europe. And the League, Bilé's group, will become the German affiliation. This meant now that it was connected to wider networks of activists in Brussels, in London, and Kouyaté was also involved in intellectual exchange with a number of prominent African Americans. How did he come into contact with Bilé in the first place? Well, this is most likely through the other man we can see, Willi Münzenberg. Münzenberg, this very influential, inspirational communist organizer and propagandist, over the course of the 1920s, had been turning Berlin really into a key center of Comintern-sponsored anti-colonial activism. Among other things, Münzenberg was the head of the League Against Imperialism. This is a broad-based front organization with its headquarters in the city. And in this role, he too had been trying to reach out and establish contact to colonial subjects based in Europe to help mobilize them against colonial oppression. And at least tentative links to Germany's African population had already been established in 1926. So what can we actually say about the League itself? Membership was open to all black people. It was Pan-African in its idea and in its mentality. It was also open to white wives. A report suggested there were around about 30 members, including several women, living largely but not exclusively in Berlin. Members were primarily from Cameroon, but there were also said to be people from Togo involved and perhaps even further afield. But the only known membership list we have, that's this one here. This was drawn up by a police informant in France. It lists 24 members, all of whom are from Cameroon, and the vast majority from Douala. We can see, you might just be able to see, here's Bilé here, named as the General Secretary. The slightly grainy image I've also shown you, these are all people who were equally involved in the League. So I'll take you through some of them that you probably will have heard of and whose names you'll find. The man in the middle is the very well-known actor, Vivian Pearson, Louis Brody. Next to him, this is Joseph Bilé. This here is Rudolf Steinberg, who lived in Hamburg. This is Hermann Munnen-Kassan, who was part of the Bonabella show troupe. At the back, we have Matthias Ndonge, who was involved in the Afrikanischer Hilfsverein in creating it. Here we have Heinrich Ndonge, and here's Ivani Nganga. All the names you'll find there. They don't all live in Berlin, some of them live in Hamburg, but they're all committed to this group. So the group had its own headquarters within the bigger headquarters of the League Against Imperialism, which was based at Friedrichstraße 24. Effectively, this address was a meeting center. It brought in a wide range of German and foreign nationals, bringing diverse activists into connection with one another and trying to at least foster collaboration. The group has its own constitution, and I think in the constitution we can see the competing influences on it. It's a hybrid product. We can see the influence of the socialist revolutionary vision of the Comintern, we can see the influence of Kouyaté's Pan-Africanism, and the more day-to-day concerns of German-based Africans. So, it variously stresses the need for unity between white and black workers worldwide. It calls for the independence of African states. It encouraged black Germans to join German trade unions. And at the same time, in keeping more with the welfare association's earlier ones, members were to provide moral and material support to one another in times of illness and unemployment. Sadly, we know all too little about the group's actual political activities. According to Bilé, members were actively engaged in an exchange of information between Germany and Africa, smuggling propaganda material, communist literature, in private letters being sent to family and friends on the west coast of Africa. As Hakim said, this was very dangerous for both groups. People in Cameroon caught with this literature could be deported up into the interior of Cameroon. They could be imprisoned. There were house searches. All sorts of things were happening. In addition, members were expected to attend and participate at political gatherings organized by the Comintern associated groups, just as Bilé had done at Alexanderplatz in 1929. Perhaps, though, I think the most intriguing example of activism is the one we know least about. So in January 1930, the Baltimore African-American newspaper drew readers' attention to the creation of a race theater project in Berlin, announced by Victor Bell, who was the League's president. And this announcement should also show us these Africans in Berlin are also intersecting in other wider transnational networks. There is a brief flurry of exchange between African-American newspaper editors and German-based Africans around about 1929, 1930. And it's largely through the African-American press, through German newspapers, and indeed Austrian newspapers, that we can at least try and reconstruct elements of the project. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that these black residents would utilize theater and performance as a means of activism. Almost all of the Africans living in Germany now had turned to performance, whether on stage, screen, or in circus, in order to make a living. They'd been shut out of normal routes of employment. And this, of course, included Bilé. Bilé had stood on the stage alongside Josephine Baker in Vienna. When he came to Berlin, he now stands on the stage alongside Paul Robeson at the first showing of The Emperor Jones, the Deutsches Künstlertheater, in 1930. The other image I just wanted to briefly show because it shows us again some of the people involved in the League. This is from the set of a film called Einbrecher from 1930. It shows us that most of the people in the League were indeed actors. I'll just point out a couple of them. This here is Joseph Boholle from the Boholle family. Behind him is Gregor Kotto. This man in the grayer suit is Thomas Manga Aqua. And I hope, or at least I try to think, this here is Bilé himself right at the back. And if you watch the film, there's about a 5-minute scene that takes place in this club. And it's really amazing to see how many black actors are featured in the scene. I think it does give us a real sense of the presence of people from the former colonies and black people in general in Germany. So, according to multiple reports, it's the actor Baby Mpisa, better known under his stage name of Louis Brody, who's behind the plans for the theatre project. His intention was to create a review show which challenged cliched images of Africa and discriminatory representations of black people. So there were to be no step dancers in top hats, there were to be no jiggling banjo players. Instead, this was to celebrate black history and culture. Brody's review was called Sonnenaufgang in Morgenland, Sunrise in Morningland. I can't tell you very much, but here's what I do know. The first half was to be performed in an unspecified Bantu language, partly, most likely in Douala, given that the majority of these people were originally from Douala. It was set around 1880. It was to critically engage with the impact of European colonialism on Africa from an African perspective. The second half was set in the present day, so that would be 1930. It would be presented in French, English, and German. The cast was composed of 30 black performers, including 8 black female performers, 3 white performers, and there was also a jazz orchestra. They had hoped to recruit a professional, well-known performers in the United States, and also to get money from Kouyate's organization in Paris. Neither of these things worked out. I can't tell you very much more, but what I can definitely say is that sometime around the beginning of December 1930, the review was actually performed. It was performed in Klim's Festsaale, so in Klim's ballroom in Neukölln, the Hasenheide, and I think that choice of venue itself is really, it tells us quite a bit. Klim's had a tradition of being linked to the workers' movement. Some of Münzenberg's organizations had been staging events there around the same time as it's put on. What we can see are 2 images. The first is apparently from rehearsals. The lady is Helen Allen from quite a well-known African-German performing family, the Allens. Next to her is Otto Makube, who was heavily involved in the League. And what we are purported to see in the other image is a photograph from the opening night. And right at the foreground is indeed this brilliant actor, Louis Brody. It's very difficult to believe that Bilé would not have been involved in the project, given that he had a history of performing in Vienna and then also in Berlin. At the same time, though, over the course of 1930, he was increasingly busy. He was emerging as the League's most influential figure, and he was being drawn into these wider anti-colonial and black liberation circles that Hakim has outlined. In July, Bilé was the League's representation at this first International Congress for Negro Workers, this 3-day event in Hamburg. And if you can remember in the image, he is the man that is at the extreme right standing up. This is an important event for Bilé because it brings him into contact with some of the most prominent black activists in the anti-colonial movement, notably the Trinidadian George Padmore. And Padmore effectively functions as a mentor for Bilé. Bilé gives a presentation in Hamburg to delegates on the exploitation of Cameroon, which will later also be published in the Negro Worker. At the end, he joins 10 delegates, he travels to Moscow, he attends the 5th Congress of the International Trade Union, and he celebrates the creation of the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers. Once back in Berlin, Bilé is increasingly active as a political agitator in large factory and street cells and as an agitprop leader, amongst other things. He's also involved in smaller discussions with the League Against Imperialism in terms of how to take forward the attempts to recruit African workers on the African continent itself. He receives political instruction, he attends propaganda courses at Berlin's Deutsche Hochschule für Politik and the Marxistische Arbeiterschule. And by the beginning of 1931, at very latest, he has now officially joined the Communist Party, the only member of the League to do so, and I think this probably makes him the first ever black German communist. He is particularly involved in the Comintern's Scottsboro campaign, this European-wide campaign to prevent the electrocution of 9 African Americans in Alabama wrongly accused of rape. Bilé's connection to Padmore helps to establish him as a key speaker, and he features at a number of organized demonstrations, speaking to audiences of up to 2,000 people, such as when he appears at the Märchenbrunnen in Volkspark Friedrichshain in May 1932, talking to well over 2,000 people. This political platform offers Bilé a number of things. He can contest stereotypes of black people prevailing in Germany. He does condemn lynch justice in the United States. He does voice grievances of Africans both in Germany and in Africa itself. He frequently testifies to the brutality of the German regime in Cameroon, particularly picking out Hauptmann Hans von Dominik, who was highly involved in punishment expeditions in parts of Cameroon. He probably was aware that there were attempts to restore some of the statues to von Dominik at exactly the same time. And he would certainly have been aware of the fact that Germany would like to have regained its colonies. He was highly critical of the Christian missions for failing to act against brutality. Equally, the French mandate authorities were subject to his criticism. His critique, however, covered all forms of outside control, and he echoed demands coming from Cameroon itself that Cameroon be granted independence. Such political activities resulted in him being arrested twice. And according to French police reports, he was well known to Joseph Goebbels, which is probably not a good thing. While Bilé was increasingly involved in Comintern agitation, though, his organization, the League, fell into infighting. Now, this is probably on account of the strains on members because of their dire financial and social situation in Germany. So it leads to all sorts of developments of intrigues and jealousies. Padmore suggests closing it down and tries to set about rescuing Bilé from a situation. So in keeping with the Comintern's policy of trying to expand its support base amongst African workers in Africa, Padmore argues that Bilé be sent to Moscow for training and future work in Cameroon. So in the summer of 1932, Bilé arrives in Moscow to attend the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. At the university, under his alias, which was Charles Morris, Bilé enrolls in Section 9, an English-speaking section devoted to Africans. His 18-month stay sees him attend classes with the future Kenyan President Jomo Kenyatta, and it brings him into contact with a number of other influential Africans and African Americans, all of whom are similarly mobile within this transnational network of African political activity. He undertakes a variety of courses in political and economic theory, focusing on themes such as the Soviet economy, Leninism, and dialectical materialism. On his politics, though, his tutors are a little bit divided. Was he a fiery nationalist, or was he a diplomat who avoided nationalist entanglements? Was he too bourgeoisie, or worse still, had he become German by living in Germany too long, and was he no longer able to empathize with the fate of Africans on the African continent? Overall, however, They were agreed that he was a model student and entirely reliable politically. Some of them thought that of all the students in Section 9, he was the one with the most potential. What Bilé made of Moscow is much more difficult to access, but a brief insight to his Moscow experience is provided by a letter of January 1933. Alongside 13 other Africans, he protests about offensive depictions of black people being produced on the Moscow stage and in Russian school textbooks. In 1934, he's completed his training. He leaves Moscow, he goes to Paris. He's provided with a letter of reference to join the French Communist Party, but very little else. In the French capital, he's penniless, he has no papers, he's picked up very quickly, hence the image over here is actually from the arrest for not having papers. He has no hope of returning to Nazi Germany, where he's left behind his daughter and all his belongings. He'll never see his daughter again. He'll never see his belongings again. During his stay in Moscow, the whole context of Pan-African and anti-colonial politics in Europe, and to a large extent in Cameroon itself, have changed. In Germany, following the Nazi seizure of power, the Comintern's anti-colonial movement has been crushed. Münzenberg's League Against Imperialism has been shut down, Padmore has fled, and Bilé's group, the League, has effectively ceased functioning. League President Victor Bell appears to have been invited to discuss the group's future by the Nazis at the Horst Wessel House in Berlin at the beginning of 1933. Officially, the group will be wound up in 1935. Now, two Bilé's mentors, Kouyaté and Padmore, have broken with the Comintern, as the latter shifted towards closer collaboration with Western powers in order to combat the threat of National Socialism. Equally, life's changing for Bilé. For a number of years, he's asked the Comintern to send him to Africa in order to go home. He hasn't seen his parents, his father has died, he hasn't seen his mother for over 20 years. His political activities, however, had made that entirely impossible. But he renounces communism. And his brother, Robert, has taken a different way in his life. He's gone down the path of working for the French Mandate authorities in Cameroon. And it's likely that these connections then allow Bilé permission to return back to Douala. He returns sometime around about 1935. He will be under quite a lot of observation. He is fleetingly in contact with one of the men we saw in the film shot, Thomas Manga Akwa, who might be worthwhile talking about later on. Back in Douala, he withdrew from political life, the reasons for which I'm happy to speculate about, but I think here's one of the big ones. For the first time, he's able to have a stable life, to have a family, and to be free of all the pressures that he had been living through during his time in Europe. So he withdraws from political life, and will be left to a younger generation of Cameroonians to continue the fight against colonialism that will eventually result in Cameroonian independence. Bilé, who died in 1959, will not live to experience this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both of your super interesting presentations. Before we now open up the round for questions from the audience, it's my privilege actually to ask the first questions. So I'd like to start with you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's good. So I'd like to start with you. You made it very clear that this kind of activism within the Comintern has this Pan-African dimension. And you briefly mentioned the publication The Negro Worker and also Isaac Wallace Johnson. So I'd like to ask you to tell us some more about the effect of this activism on political organization and acts of resistance in colonial territories in Africa.
Okay. Okay, I think the first thing to re-emphasize is that it was extremely difficult for people to act in most of the colonies. Papers such as the Negro Worker were illegal the British colonies and in the French colonies, and were generally smuggled in. And as I think Robbie mentioned, people could be arrested and be sentenced to quite severe penalties for even having possession of this information. So it's important to remember that the colonial regimes didn't encourage or facilitate communist organizing. But some organizing did go on. Certainly in French West Africa and other parts of the continent. Perhaps the most significant organizer, I would say, would be probably Wallace Johnson in the British colonies. Wallace Johnson was a Labour activist who was mainly active in Sierra Leone, but also in the Gold Coast, and for a time also in Nigeria. So he established workers' organizations, labor organizations, which were often, quite small, but were influential. He also organized on other kind of international issues. So the fascist invasion of Ethiopia, we find Wallace Johnson organizing big protest events in the Gold Coast, and similar events were organized in other places. But in most of these colonies, particularly in the African colonies, it was very, very difficult to organize. We also have to remember that in most places in Africa, there were not communist parties. There were individuals attempting to organize or attempting to even work with others in very difficult conditions, maybe one or two people. Even in places like South Africa, where there was a communist party, and the Communist Party organized in some cases quite effectively. It organized amongst trade unionists, it organized amongst farmers, it protested against this is in the period before apartheid, but many of the laws which distinguished the apartheid regime already existed in South Africa before 1948. Its activists were very militant in opposing those laws. Again, it was extremely dangerous. Many of them were arrested several times, and there is also example of at least one black communist in South Africa being effectively killed by the state forces. So yeah, it was I would say extremely difficult. There were a few activists. The main activity would often be based around Negro worker, organizing around it, disseminating it, and it's only really when the Italian invasion of Ethiopia is such a big event that it was possible to organize bigger demonstrations, manifestations. The other, I guess, some of the other things we've heard about are the recruitment of people to be trained in the Soviet Union in Moscow. Was another kind of activity that people were engaged in. And then there were also connections between various individuals and the League Against Imperialism in Europe. So when the League Against Imperialism was expelled from Germany, its headquarters were transferred to London, and it continued to function up until about 1935, 36. So you often find that the activities that those who were organized under the wing of the Comintern was providing information for the League Against Imperialism. And then that information would be used, particularly in the British situation, to ask questions in Parliament, or to write articles, or to create pressure, or to criticize the colonial authorities and so on. So that's the kind of activities I would say that went on in Africa. Obviously, in the Caribbean is a slightly different situation, but again, there are few activists. There are one or two activists sometimes. Sometimes the Communist International would be able to encourage or recruit trade union leaders and work with them, or try and work with them. But it was very, very difficult work, and you don't see, great political changes being effected during this period, in the interwar period. What are established are these important networks of individuals or people that then gradually begin to be influential, have some significance, sometimes in the later period, or the conditions are created for other important organizations to operate. In South Africa, for example, the Communist Party worked very closely with the African National Congress, and as you know, in the period after 1945, there's almost a linking of the two organizations together, so that the key members of the ANC, like Walter Mandela, Nelson Mandela, Winston Sisulu, and others, were all communists. So you can say the Communist Party of South Africa, which was started in the 1920s, eventually had a very great significance on the liberation movement in that particular part of Africa. But it was slow and gradual work. And even to develop communist parties in this period was not possible in most parts of Africa.
Yeah, thank you. I ask about it because I still find it very impressive that they managed at the time to establish such a wide network, even if, especially in the colonies, in Africa, it were mostly individuals, but they established this network that later on became more important and led to something more striking.
I should just add one other thing, that in the French colonies, obviously in the period when the Popular Front government was established in the late 1930s, then there were more possibilities in the French colonies to establish more open networks. In the early period, even to organize workers, to organize trade unions, was often prohibited, often illegal. So even to get together groups of workers could be quite difficult.
Then I was wondering, as you can see, we have this question mark in the title of our event, Black Marxism. So I was wondering in how far Joseph Bilé can be considered as a black Marxist.
Wow, what a question. One of the difficulties I think we have when looking at the lives of any Africans in Germany is that they've left behind very few traces of their own voice. So we're always having to read their voice through the voices of others. And in Bilé's case, this is absolutely the same. Clearly, he is a political, committed activist. We see this from the very beginning, that he joins the Afrikanische Hilfsverein, that he does feel it important to sign de Boer's petition to the National Assembly, asking that Cameroon be granted independence, and that there's a relationship between Cameroon and Germany. We also see this partly in his private life. When he lives in Vienna, there's an interesting incident when he is given employment to perform. And on the performance contract, it says a certain amount of money he's going to be paid, and when he eventually gets paid, it's quite a lot less. So he takes the step of actually taking the manager to court. Now, it's not an awful lot of money that's missing out on, and he does say this to the court. It's not about the money, it's about the principle. I, as a black person, am equal to any white person, so why then are you trying to do me out of this money, so to speak? So I think he has a keen sense of justice, of equal rights that we see in terms of a later political commitment. As Hakim has said, and I've also wanted to underscore, it's dangerous being a communist and being associated with that, particularly in the early 1930s. We saw the image of Hilarius Gilgas, the fact that he was murdered for being both a communist agitator and also being black shows the potential consequences of the type of work that Bilé is involved in. I can't tell you whether he would define himself as a Marxist, but he quite clearly was against racism. He quite clearly was for justice and equality, and he was absolutely wanting to demand the colony and that African states would be given independence. To my mind, I think that's doing pretty damn well for that time period.
And so one could also maybe say that the Comintern was so attractive to these activists because they were the only one offering a real opposition to the leading system, right? They were the only one who clearly spoke out against racism, and they were the only one who really wanted to overcome the colonial system, right? So
absolutely. I think the fact that the Comintern and Münzenberg are actively looking to help and providing a language that the Africans can use, giving them power, a platform, giving them some financial help, not as much as I think some of the Africans were hoping for, but providing them with an audience who was interested in what they had to say about colonialism and interested also what they had to say more about the pressing needs of being a black person with almost no citizenship living in Germany. I think the Comintern clearly provided lots of potential opportunities for these Africans. And as you said, it is the only institution that is actively trying to do so. It plays a huge role, I think, in trying at least to improve the situation of the Africans living in Germany in the late 1920s.
Okay, and then I have one more question for both of you. You both briefly mentioned some women, but besides that, it's a very male-dominated kind of activism. So my question is, what about the women?
Do you want to go first? I've got one. Well, I can in the German context. I tried recently to statistically see how many Africans we can find who came to Germany pre-1914, partly going through passenger lists. And I came up with more than 1,000 names. Less than, well under 10% were women. And all of them had returned to Africa pre-1914, as indeed the vast majority of Africans who came to Germany. It was never the idea of the colonial authorities, the German authorities, that Africans would be able to take up permanent residency. And I think the majority of Africans who arrived never really intended to stay. When the war happens, they're basically shot. I can't think of a single African woman who was still living in Germany at that time, but clearly there's now a second generation. There were absolutely black women who were at some of these demonstrations. We can see from the posters. Unfortunately, the posters do not name them. But one lady who perhaps is worthwhile mentioning is Maria Mandesi Bell. Maria Mandesi Bell was educated in Eberswalda. She went to school there. She was anecdotally perhaps liaised with Ngosu Din, who was the secretary of Rudolf Douala Mangabel, who some of you might know. Ngosu Din came from Cameroon to Germany in 1913-14 to bring protests against the expropriation of the Douala. Maria Mandesi Bell will later live in Paris, where she sets up a salon, where effectively, out of that, develops the publishing house Présence Africaine. So some of these women who had experiences in Germany do indeed have a political consciousness, they work for rights equality. Another lady that might be worthwhile thinking in a Cameroonian context would be the daughter of Charles Atangana, who spent time in Germany as well. She was educated, I think, by the Palatine Missionary Mission, Catholic mission, and when she went back to Cameroon, she was also active as an African leader in a Cameroonian context. But unfortunately, finding materials about people is very difficult. And finding materials about women is especially difficult. The two women that I showed you, Esther Siki Bilé went back and worked in a school, and Bertha Mbenge did the same. They weren't politically active because the opportunities to be politically active were greatly, greatly limited.
Yeah, I think that's right. Generally speaking, certainly in Europe, there are definitely fewer African women, whether that's in Germany or in France or in Britain or in other places. That most of those who were around were male, and most of those who were active politically were also male. I mentioned one important woman, Hermina Huisveld, who was Otto Huisveld's wife, who was from Guyana, who was an important activist. His partner in the work that he did, or that they did in Europe during this period. She was, arrested along with him and so on. So she was particularly important. The other woman, sometimes the women who are important in these organizations are almost written out of the archive. So one very important woman, as I mentioned earlier, was Frieda Schief, who was George Padmore's wife, so-called, who was Austrian, and was also his co-worker producing Negro Worker while he was based in Hamburg. Nobody knows, I don't know if anybody knows who she was. You might see one mention of her in the archives. So the women who were key in these movements were not necessarily always African women. Very often they were German women or French women or English women. Similarly, in the French organizations, Ligue de Défense de la Race Nègre, the Union of Black Workers, whatever it's called, yes, in France, which was a success organization. Again, the women that played active roles were the wives of the men, they were often French women. Not always, but sometimes. So one has to, there are difficulties with presenting that history in terms of presenting women activists, because either they weren't there or the archive doesn't present them in a way that it makes it easy for historians to then present them. The other thing, which it has to be said, is that these investigations need more people doing the investigating. It's extraordinary that we're speaking in Germany and there's two people from Britain speaking. Why is that? That I find astonishing. Two people from Britain and the whole meeting is in English. That's unbelievable. We would never have a meeting like this in Britain, where it was in German and the two speakers. So that's not to criticize anybody, of course, but
to inspire.
Exactly. But it's important. That is your history. So why isn't anybody interested in it? I can't understand that.
I mean, at least the room is full, so there are people interested.
So then, yes, but one can't be passively interested. You have to be actively interested. So then it's important to investigate, particularly in this period in German history. This history is vitally important. So yes, it's a call for people to involve themselves in presenting this history. It's very, very important for young people, especially, that they don't grow up in the way that I grew up, where anyone who looked like me is invisible. This is, it's like child abuse. How can you grow up in a society which doesn't present you, doesn't talk about you, doesn't say anything positive, says you have no history? And this is what the enemy say. They say these people don't have a history. Whether they're talking about Africans or working people or whoever, or women. So it's very, very important that we defend this history. And when you have some understanding, then you have a responsibility. If you're ignorant, then you don't have any responsibility. So you all have some understanding. So I look forward to coming back to Berlin. I won't be able to understand anything because it'll all be in German.
So I'd say we take this as an inspiring empowerment talk to do some more research and work, but in the defense of things are going on in Germany, I must say in the last few decades they had been a lot going on, as you probably know. But you're right, it could be more, and especially it could be more at the center of dominant German narratives. Yeah, but anyways, enough from me at this point. So now I'd like to open up the discussion and yeah, be happy to get your questions. Yeah. They have a mic.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I wonder about, I think both can ask maybe, about the impact of the First World War, because we know that lots of Africans, thousands of Africans, came to Europe to fight the First World War and to defend Europeans' interests. And I wonder if this direct contact with Africans and this relation in war was decisive or not for the anti-colonial fight in the Comintern, if that was an important element or not.
Yeah, well, there's so many things that one could say. The First World War is very important in that it, first of all, generally, the general political situation, because it gave rise to the Russian Revolution. So from that point of view, it's a key moment, and also the German Revolution, and others one could talk about. So from a political point of view, it's very important. From the point of view of Africans coming to Europe, also, yes, very important. I suppose particularly in France, where the numbers of Africans were enormous. France had the biggest African population. And obviously some of those became important activists. Willi Münzenberg is an obvious example. He was a combatant in the French army, invalided out, decorated war hero, and joined the communist movement, and in fact died of the injuries that he'd sustained through gassing in the First World War. I think it's important. I think it's important also in people's consciousness, people's thinking, that they have fought alongside Europeans. The kind of racist myths which were presented about Europe and Europeans have been certainly undermined by the experience of the war. So it's important in that way. And you actually find many former combatants joining the communist movement generally. James Ford was also African-American communist, was also a combatant. There were a number of them who participated in the First World War. In Britain, Arnold Ward, who was one of the leaders of the Negro Welfare Association, was actually interned in Germany during the First World War. And there were several people who were imprisoned in Germany, particularly seafarers or people who were... In those days, many Africans or people of African heritage worked on ships because it was a way of moving out of wherever you were and seeing the world and so on. And some of those were imprisoned in Germany and so on. So many had that experience of the war, and that, raised their understanding, their political attitude to a whole range of things. So yeah, generally it has its significance. In France, it's particularly important because it creates the possibility of not only of organizing, but of organizing between France and the French colonies. So again, through seafarers, through disseminating literature, Negro worker, and so on. And so you find people like Kouyaté were particularly strong at organizing amongst the many seafarers in France. It also gave the possibilities there to organize amongst African factory workers and so on. So it presents different possibilities in different countries. France is a bit different, I would say, to Germany and Britain. But it also the other thing which I think is important about the First World War is also what happened to to Germany's former empire and the impact that generally had on Pan-African politics, because one of the issues there was that there was then a demand from various people that these confiscated German colonies should be given to Africans to administer for themselves. So in the general Pan-African movement, that was a significant demand. So clearly, such a major conflict is going to have all kinds of impacts and influences and so on. So, but yeah, those are some of them that come to mind.
I think in the German case, the First World War has a really transformative impact on Germany's black population. Pre-1914, we have largely a mobile, transient population of people who are coming and going, but when the war breaks out, those who are still in Germany, most of them didn't come to stay. Sailors, servants, people who came for education, now are effectively stuck. There is no way back home. Once the war ends, as Hakim said, Germany loses its colonies. The French mandate authorities, the British mandate authorities do not want these people going back to Africa. So we now have a much smaller black population, but a much more stable black population. The chances for growth are highly limited. Growth will really only take place through the birth of second, third generation children. And what's a pressing need for most of these people is a status. They have lost what little status they had before they were German colonial subjects. Now they aren't even that. They should have protection from the mandate states, but they don't want to take responsibility. So it's not a surprise that we should see over the course of the 1920s more and more of clusters of people coming together to really form a coherent community, who then have to take a step forward politically to simply say, we are here, we have rights, we want these rights. The Afrikanischer Hilfsverein, which in many ways is seen as a welfare association, simply by existing and demanding rights, makes it a political organization. So I think that the First World War is really transformative and really important in the way that it shapes the potential opportunities for the lives of the Africans who still live in Germany.
Yeah, I just add very briefly that the war in Britain, the war also contributed to almost like a revolutionary situation in Britain, not quite, but on the way to being something like that. And one could argue that one of the ways that to disrupt that was the increase in racism. So 2019 is the centenary of the racist attacks, racist riots that broke out in Britain in that year, in whatever it is, 9 different towns and cities in Britain. So you actually find that the black population of Britain were further under attack, you could say, in the post-war period. And in some ways that led to more organizing, particularly amongst those who were seafarers. So some of the first activists connected with the Communist Party, people like Chris Jones and others, began their organizing to try and deal with some of the problems of the racism that existed generally and the problems which existed in the Seamen's Union. In those years in Britain, the Seamen's Union was a particularly reactionary, its leadership were particularly reactionary and racist. So, yeah.
I'd just very quickly about sorry. It just came to my head. About the German situation, you have people who came for educational reasons who are trained like Bilé as a civil engineer, but there's no chance of him getting a job as a civil engineer in an interwar Germany. Not simply because of the economic problems within Germany itself, but because of rising discrimination. So people who came from a West African elite, from in some cases very privileged backgrounds, are increasingly sliding down a social scale. They're having to be very mobile in places like Berlin. So, for example, Thomas Manga Aqua moved house something like 8 times within 4 years to try and find ever cheaper accommodation. It's not a surprise then that they come into contact with people who might be involved in socialist and communist organizations, which then helps to also politicize them. They find support from members of the white working class within Germany who see some sort of connection to them as well.
So in general, there's an increasing number of people of African heritage in all of these European countries, especially the 3 we're talking about. And so that also assists in people becoming more organized. So in Britain and in France, there are more workers, then there are also more students, more intellectuals. So the period after 1918, 1919 is one of organizing, both from the point of view of the Communist International, but also the wider Pan-African movement and the networks that existed internationally.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank both of the panelists for the very fascinating insights you've shared with us today. In the discussion, it was mentioned that the Comintern was actually the only political organization that took on black activists at the time in the context, and the only political organization that fought for anti-colonial and anti-racist goals. But that got me very curious, so I was wondering about the racism within the Comintern. So if you could maybe touch on the racism that some of the black Marxists experienced within the Comintern. Thank you.
I think the key issue, or let me put it this way, they're probably the way things presented themselves. It was more a question of a failure to act on those issues which were particularly of concern to, one can say, to black people. That's one of the key problems. So as I mentioned earlier, that the British Party in particular, the French Party, and others, failed to do very much. They're directed to organize black workers, students, and so on. They're directed to know what is going on and organize in their colonial territories, and so on. But for various reasons, they were very slow to do that, or they found it very difficult to do that. So that is why you find that many black communists, I'm thinking particularly in the French Party, also to some extent in Britain, but more in the French Party, complaining that, well, we are trying to organize, but we're not getting much support, whether that's financial support or other types of support. Later on, when you have people like George Padmore in Hamburg, for example, where he's complaining about various people in the German party, they're not very helpful, or they're not supportive enough financially, or they disregard this request or something like this. So I think that is a way that things tended to manifest themselves, rather than in what we would see as racism today. Of course, you'd find that in other parties as well. As I mentioned, in the South African party, you have a party which only comprises people of European heritage. So that was definitely a problem. And so that was criticized, obviously, by the few Africans who were around, but also by the Communist International itself. So those are the examples that come to mind immediately. You also find later with people like Padmore and Kouyaté, they wanted to organize, you then get the other side of the coin. Then people start saying, well, we're trying to do this. Why should we report to the French party? Or why should we report to the British party? We should be reporting to somebody in Moscow or something else. So how things are organized in a particular country becomes a problem. And particularly for someone like Padmore, who was organizing, had global responsibilities, but still had to work with individual parties. And sometimes found that difficult and found that things moved too slowly, and then sometimes did things which were, unauthorized, let us say. And that also created problems and tensions, and eventually led to, his dismissal or resignation. But anyway, that's another long story. But I think those would be the key issues, rather than people, calling each other names or something like this.
I'd like to add a little question to that, because from what I got, wasn't it also like a certain inner conflict within the Comintern about the whole class before race ideology? Because at a certain point, these African activists figured that it's not all about the class struggle, and racism will be overthrown if the class struggle ended, but race is actually an issue, and they made it more of a topic, and then that brought them into conflict with the so to say Soviet ideology, and that finally also led them to get more involved with the Pan-African movement and leave the Comintern like mid-30s behind or so?
No. Not in my view, no. There is definitely, it depends who your example is, or what example you're thinking of. But generally speaking, as I was trying to indicate, that wasn't an issue of like policy. There was no, if you take somebody like Padmore, who's the best example, Kouyaté is a little bit different, but Padmore is a good example of somebody who parted company. But when he left, he said, well, he had no disagreement in terms of ideology or politics. So the disagreement was about how things were organized. And in fact, in his case, the disagreement was also about the fact that he was directed to relinquish his post and go somewhere else, and he refused to do that. So then that created big problems. So then, when he refused to do that, and there's a whole disciplinary thing and so on, then he started to make all kinds of allegations about other things. But there was no issue of politics. In that there may be others who change their views and so on. The thing is that in politics, people leave political organizations. This is a fact of life. But sometimes when they do it, then they start to make allegations that this wasn't right and that wasn't right. But if you read my book, I go through it very, very carefully, step by step by step, what happened. And I don't, not that I'm picking a fight with Robbie at all, I don't agree with this view that the Communist International started to be friendly with Britain and France and so on. I don't see any evidence of that. This is what people said. In fact, people like Padmore said it. But where is the evidence for this position? If you look at the Negro worker in 1936, 1937, so on, it has the same positions. The Communist International has the same positions. The Soviet Union has different positions because it's a state. And it has to have state-to-state relations, and it joins the League of Nations, and it has to maneuver. The Soviet Union is one thing. Communist International is another thing. And people think this is a monolith, they're all one thing, and I can assure you that they were not. Pity that they weren't. But they weren't. So, you know, even when the Communist International said, this is what we're going to do, all the parties did something different. So the idea that everything is, you know, directed from Moscow, it's not how it was.
I'd just say very briefly, in the Berlin situation, there are, at least on the edges of the document, suggestions of tension, not really with the Communist Party itself or with the Comintern, more with people involved in the League Against Imperialism. And I think this is partly due to tensions about money, resources, access to these things. So Chato, who is an Asian activist, one of the most important with the League Against Imperialism, he didn't think very much of the Africans in Berlin. He didn't think that they were really politicized enough, that they would create a strong cadre. He didn't particularly think that Bilé was overly gifted, all of which then Bilé reported back to Moscow in what appears to have been quite a heated discussion. And Kouyaté then tries partly to be diplomatic, defend the Africans in Berlin, but also be somewhat critical of some of the demands that they have. What I always think, though, when I read the manifesto of the League for the Defense of the Negro Race, I'm not really sure where I see the Africans in Berlin in this, because there's very, very little about the day-to-day struggles of their lives. There's a lot of grand rhetoric, which fits in with a lot of things we've been saying, but those day-to-day struggles of simply getting married, of finding employment, of just having enough to eat, none of that is mentioned there. And I think there are unrealistic demands from Africans in Germany for what they hope that the Communist International can offer, but these stem from the socio-economic situation in which they increasingly find themselves, and particularly moving towards 32, 33, when racial tension is really rising in Germany, and some of them are sending letters saying, this is the worst it's ever been, how do I get out of this place? And some start then moving away and trying to go to France. So I don't think it's really examples of racism, it's this competition for resources, it's the context in which these people are living and having to fight for their rights and stand up for their rights.
Okay, I'd like to suggest with regard to the time, maybe we collect like 3 more questions, or at least show me who else wants to pose question. There, anybody else? There, there, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask about the period after 1935 and the Comintern. In particular, looking at the contradiction between, maybe it's the Soviet Union, maybe it's the Comintern, but their position towards Spain, support for the Second Spanish Republic, which then supports colonialism in Morocco. And I'm wondering what effect that has on a lot of black diasporic members, communists who went to Spain, volunteered in Spain, Afro-Cubans, African-Americans, to fight Franco, of course, but also to strike a blow against Italian imperialism as a way to vicariously fight against Italy, who, of course, in 1935 invaded Ethiopia. So I'm wondering how much of the Comintern or the Soviet Union's continuation and support for Spanish colonialism in Morocco, or Spanish presence in Morocco, that, of course, is a contradiction if you have volunteers who go to fight against imperialism. And so what effect did that have on black communist members, black diasporic communist members? And then, you know, on the outside of that, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, who are writing, I think it was C.L.R. James who said, you know, the revolution in Europe will ignore colored workers at its peril. Arguing for there has to be support for the Moroccans, demanding independence as a way to undercut support, or Moroccans fighting in Spain. There's a lot there, but I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
I got to be honest, I'm going to have to pass the buck. I I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I can say anything. I do think, though, for Africans living in Germany, they now have bigger problems to worry about. And to a large extent, they're cut off from these circles after 1933. The very fact that Victor Bell could be invited by the Nazis into what was effectively a wild camp made it quite clear, I think, to that generation that it's time to take a step back from the public sphere. And increasingly, this is what's going to be happening. So I'm sorry, it's a great question, but I quite simply can't answer it.
Doesn't have to be just blacks in Germany,
I mean, I think in a way you kind of answered your own question, to be honest. So I'm not sure that I need to say too much. You know, the fact that people went to fight in Spain from Europe, from African Americans, Africans, it kind of speaks for itself. I think the question is, you seem to be suggesting that the Communist International shouldn't have supported the. Okay, so then you support that support is given. You know, they're fighting like a life and death struggle, which they lost. So the key thing is to, I think the key thing at that time was to preserve the Republic and to give it support. And that's obviously what the call for the international brigades was. That's what they carried out. There are obviously all kinds of, you know, issues that arise. And people, you know, raise the same questions about the, you know, the Popular Front government in France and so on. But you have to look at the you know, the situation which existed in these countries at the time and what the key issues were, and how the forces were being deployed at that time. There are, of course, these other questions that needed to be considered. One can only speculate that if the Republic had endured, what might then have happened. But of course, that's just speculation. And similarly with the situation in the Popular Front in France. If you actually look at the French situation, you see that actually the favourable conditions which were, you know, created during the Popular Front period in the colonies, particularly the African colonies. So I think that the support of the Spanish Republic was, seemed to me to be, you know, what needed to be done at the time. It was unsuccessful, and everybody who could contribute to it, you know, contributed to it. You know, sometimes people ask, and I won't go on, that's enough.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to fuse two questions into one, so please feel free to pick and choose. I would like to know if there were any black queer activists at Comintern, and I would also like to know if you could shed light on how the contemporary black movements view Marxism in the context of the rising right-wing dictatorships across the world. Thank you very much.
And can we maybe also hear the next question? And then I'd like to ask you to answer, and afterwards from the vibe I get here and from the advanced time I see, I would like to suggest that we then keep on continuing the conversation over a drink or two. So, please.
Yes, I was a bit surprised about your analysis of the Comintern, because I'd say there was a Stalinist turn towards the end of the 1920s. And so my question is, did I get you right that you'd say that this didn't have any impact on black organizations affiliated with the Comintern?
I don't remember saying that.
Okay, then I didn't get you right, so... Then the question is, what kind of influence would you say did the Stalinist turn of the Comintern have?
Okay, we are struggling.
Okay.
We are struggling a little bit with the first two questions. So
I've got it.
you got it? Okay.
Okay. Yes, with the first question, I can't think of any openly queer activists. I can't think of any that I know proclaimed. I might be wrong. I might have forgotten somebody, but I can't think of anybody. You know, we have a very famous, well, not very famous, a very significant black communist in Britain called Desmond Buckle, who joined the party in the 1930s, was an activist in many different fields until his death in 1964. And I was looking into his life a long time ago, and I remember asking, you know, was he married? No, he wasn't married. Did he have any girlfriends? No, he didn't have any girlfriends. And I asked the person who I was interested in, did he have any boyfriends? And she was, you know, a bit shocked that I asked that question. But she said no, she didn't know. So he's the only. So you find people who, maybe he was, I don't know. But I don't have any evidence that he was, and I can't think of anybody else. Your second question about what the Marxists think about.
How the black movement view Marxism in the context of the right-wing dictatorship supporters.
I think it's difficult to be precise about that question. I don't know, we could ask the black movement in Germany what they think about Marxism. I mean, which movement are we talking about? That's a difficult question to answer because the movements that exist today in different countries and internationally are, you know, they're comprised of different political trends and so on, of which Marxism is certainly one. But I think, generally speaking, people who have progressive politics are generally opposed to the rise of such populism. But the issue is not so much to be opposed to it, but to be doing something about it. Not so much doing something about it, but doing something. So this I think is the key thing, that those who have different views on things have to organize themselves, and whether they're Marxist or not Marxist. In fact, whether they're being a Marxist is not the issue, really. It's how to change things and move things forward, whether it's in Germany or Britain or Africa or wherever it is. On the issue of the Comintern, if one looks at the history of the Comintern, it goes through different, periods, we can say, and those different periods are connected with the world situation generally. So the period after the First World War, the period of the 20s, is one of kind of recovery, of economic recovery generally in the world, and particularly in the most developed countries, in Germany, in the US, and elsewhere. The period of the 30s was a very different period, certainly economically very different. And so it required a different approach from the communist parties. The period from the mid-1930s leading up to war was also a different period, when the threat of fascism was, anyway, you people know this. So therefore you can't be pursuing the same political approaches that you had in 1919 and in 1937. That would be ridiculous. So these things changed. The period from 1929 to 1935, 36 is the period of the most intense activity as far as we can say black people are concerned in relation to the Comintern. The International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers is a feature of that period. The transformation of the South African Communist Party is a feature of that period. the unity of the American Party is a feature of that period, and the presentation of the Negro question in the US as a central question for the party is a feature of that period. So if one wants to criticize that, as that was the position of the Comintern, then okay, that's your view. I don't accept that view. To my mind, that was a very crucial period. As I said earlier, in the US, you had the beginnings of the establishment of the idea of black power, the empowerment of African Americans, the foundations of what later became the civil rights movement. We've outlined the significance of that period, the importance of organizing the working people of the colonial countries. If we look at how the Pan-African movement developed after 1945, with the Manchester Pan-African Congress, it's precisely that politics. Yes, we must organize against amongst the workers. So what is the criticism of that politics? I don't understand that.
But I must say, I still find it very interesting that you posed this kind of gender question, because I also recognize that there is a certain type of male, very masculine, anti-colonial black activist created also within this paper, the Negro, if we look at the cover. But of course, not all activists were the same type of activist, and surely has been some more diversity, also gender-wise, but that there has not been so really much research about this, as far as I know, but it's definitely an interesting view on this topic. So thanks for posing this question. And then we have one last question over there, and then I'm very, very happy to continue the conversation over the drinks I promised earlier. So there we go.
So I wanted to thank the speakers for their presentation, but I have a question specifically on the subtitle of the talk, which is Anti-Colonial Activists in the Comintern more broadly, especially given the parallelisms between the anti-imperialist perspective and tone for people of the African diaspora. There's also a similar thing happening with people who are Arab and Muslims. So there was an Arab and Muslim Congress within the Comintern that had simultaneously taken an anti-imperialist kind of positioning. However, what was somewhat distinct is that in a moment in which there were active trade union movements, particularly Palestine and Tunisia, etc., there was a kind of gulf between those who were Arabs who were part of the trade union movement and those who had been sent to be part of the Comintern versus those who had been trained in Paris or living in Paris and part of socialist and Marxist groups. So I want to know if within your research, was there any kind of conversation between those who had been part of the Arab or Muslim Congress, as well as those who had been part of the Black Congress, or more trade union leadership within the, or participation within the African continent itself, and how they were in conversation, if at all, with the Comintern? Thank you.
That's a great question. I really wish I could say very much to it. I can. What I can do, though, is say that in the League Against Imperialism, in their headquarters, they had offices not just for Germany's African population, but also for Asian students, for part of the Arab population. Whether conversations ever happened, I wish I could tell you. There's no documents that I've seen that would allow me to say that. What I could also say, though, is when Bilé would speak on certain issues, you might also have an Asian activist talking exactly the same time. So that there is a broad-based platform, but to what extent these people then communicate with one another under conditions where they're competing for the same kind of resources, I'm afraid I don't know.
I think we have to look at the specifics of this. Obviously, in the Communist International, sometimes different areas of the world are divided. I mentioned earlier that the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, for example, didn't organize in South America, or didn't really organize in Central America. There was another body that had that responsibility. But certainly, if we're talking about people from North Africa and people from other parts of Africa, okay. Well, again, we have to look at the context. That may not have happened much in Germany, and it certainly didn't happen in Britain, but then it obviously happened in France. the initial organization of the French Communist Party, the Intercolonial Union, obviously involved not just people from North Africa, from Africa, the Caribbean, but also Vietnamese and so on and so forth. And then the organizations that were formed, the North African Star and other organizations, irrespective of their affiliation, also talk to other organizations. The key aspect of that, I suppose, would be, again, during the fascist invasion of Ethiopia, when there's a major conference of Arabs and blacks, as it was called, held in Paris, and there's a lot of cooperation between the French-based organizations. So, that's obviously peculiar to the conditions of France in that period, but one would expect that, just as and again also in the League Against Imperialism. If you look at the 27 conference in Brussels and the 29 conference in Frankfurt, again you see those discussions and representatives of all those organizations around. People organized according to their thinking in that period and the circumstances of that period. We might, with our wisdom and experience, we may have other views, but they did what they thought worked then. Sometimes there were difficulties, but I think that certainly we see those connections, people talking to each other, organizations working together, in particular localities and so on.
So thank you very much for this great discussion, and also thank you very much to Robbie Aitken and Hakim Adi for sharing your really extensive knowledge with us tonight. And now I just wish all of us a very nice evening to be continued. And thank you very much.